We live in a world of exquisite diversity, with more species than we can possibly count. Here in Lake Malawi, for instance, there are hundreds of different fish that are found nowhere else. Why so many? Why so different? A 150 years ago, Charles Darwin published on the origin of species. And in that one great book, he asked the right question and gave the right answer.
Where, asked Darwin, does all this diversity come from? And answered that it must be the product of evolution. Species, he argued, give rise to other species. And as they do so, they change. The changes are minute and subtle, but given enough time, the results could be spectacular. And so they are.
Darwin's explanation for life on Earth was so seductive and so simple that it seems obvious today. And yet, Darwin's explanation of how evolution works was riddled with holes. Its logical foundations were shaky. His evidence was weak. There was so much he did not, could not know. Darwin trusted that future generations of scientists would complete his work and prove the essential truth of his vision. And for 150 years, that is what we have been doing. In this film, I'll chart the decline, fall, and ultimate triumph of Darwin's ideas. And I'll show how evolutionary theory has itself evolved, so that it is now far more vast and subtle than ever he imagined. In September 1835, Charles Darwin arrived in the Galapagos archipelago and did what he always did when arriving in a new place. He got out his gun and began to collect. Among the many inhabitants of the Galapagos that Darwin pinned, pickled, shot, or stuffed are these 4 birds. They don't look like much, but look at them closely. Look at them as Darwin looked at them, and you can see the beginnings of evolution. They're mockingbirds. Each comes from a different island, and each is subtly different from the others. They differ in the shape of their bills and the size of their bodies and the color of their plumage. It was these differences that first caused Darwin to wonder whether species might transform over time. Darwin surmised that the birds were variants of the same species and must therefore descend from a common ancestor, a mockingbird which had somehow found its way to the Galapagos many years earlier. That was Darwin's hunch. But how to prove it? He certainly couldn't produce the hypothetical ancestor. It was lost in time. So he did what scientists do when they don't have the data. He appealed to an analogy. Darwin bred pigeons. They were for him a microcosm of evolution. They showed how any creature could, given enough time, be transformed into something very different from its ancestor. For implausible though it may seem, these gorgeous, monstrous, inbred aristocrats of the avian world, the Scandaroon, the frillback, the Jacobin, not to forget the Mookie, are all descended from this, the plebeian rock pigeon. All pigeons are, at birth, subtly different from each other. Breeders select those with desirable features to survive and reproduce. And they cull the rest. the desirable features accumulate from generation to generation and become exaggerated. And so, remarkably quickly, the birds evolve. Nature, Darwin said, works like that. It favors some features and permits others to wither away. He called this process natural selection.
All this explains why the first chapter of The Origin of Species is not about the wonders of the natural world, but rather about pigeons. Understand the pigeon, he is saying. Believe the pigeon, and all the rest follows. Or does it?
For Darwin had a problem. Natural selection was the cornerstone of his theory. It was for him the engine of evolution. And yet, it was by no means clear that natural selection really worked. There is, he said, a war of nature. Famine, violence, and death are everywhere. Species and individuals are locked in a struggle for existence. The strong survive and reproduce, while the weak go to the wall. Given enough variation, this selective pressure is enough to bring about slow, incremental change. This was the theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin unveiled in The Origin of Species. While the idea of evolution was not in itself new, no one had argued it more forcefully or documented the evidence for it with greater rigor. But was it right? Had Darwin really made his case? Of course, many religious types hated the very idea of evolution. But some of Darwin's fellow scientists weren't too keen either. Notably Richard Owen, who wrote one of the first reviews of The Origin.
Richard Owen, premier paleontologist, coined the term dinosaur, helped design these things.
Rampaging through a South London park, these marvelous reconstructions were built in the 1850s. They are a tableau of dinosaur life based on Owen's research. Owen had vague evolutionary leanings. He thought that species change intermittently under the influence of some divine law, and that periodically they are swept away in some great catastrophe. He loathed Darwin's godless evolutionism.
Owen was a thoroughly nasty piece of work. His review of The Origin, rich in malice, dripping with sarcasm, damns Darwin even as it praises himself, all anonymously, of course. Mr. Darwin's rash speculations degrade science. He's as bad as the French. And, continues Owen, he doesn't know anything about fossils. If he did, he would know that ichthyosaurs appear in the lower Jurassic, stay there pretty much unchanged, and then just disappear. No sign of evolution there.
Owen's venom was probably born from mere spite. Still, he did seem to have the fossil record on his side. According to Darwin's theory, gradual change should be visible in the rocks. But it wasn't. Instead, species seemed to arrive and depart, leaving little in between. Such gaps in the fossil record would haunt Darwin's theory. The evidence for natural selection simply wasn't there. Even his friends had their doubts. Thomas Henry Huxley worked here at Imperial College London, where I now work. A firebrand and a populist, they called him Darwin's bulldog. Huxley also reviewed The Origin. It's a magnificent work. It makes the case for evolution. But then he turns to natural selection.
Yes, it's logical. Yes, it's simple. But has Mr. Darwin actually seen a species originate by natural selection? Can he even prove that it really exists? Well, no. It's a hypothesis, perhaps the best one going, but, and I say this as a friend, you understand, Mr. Darwin really hasn't proved his point.
Huxley said, natural selection can't be seen. Others said it doesn't work. They claimed that it was logically flawed, that it was inconsistent with Darwin's account of inheritance, of how species transmit their features from one generation to the next.
This is how Darwin thought inheritance works. Suppose one parent has dark feathers, fur, or skin the color of black coffee, while the other is milky white. Their progeny would be a mix of the two. They would be a blend. It seems like an innocuous idea, quite a reasonable one too. After all, isn't this how human skin color is inherited?
But Darwin had walked into a theoretical trap, and a Scottish engineer called Fleming Jenkin sprang it. This is how Jenkin phrased the argument. Imagine that a white man arrives on an island of Negroes. He would, no doubt, make himself king. He would take many Negro wives and father many mulatto children. Yet no matter how successful our hero is, no matter how superior, his coffee-colored descendants would become progressively darker. Within a few generations, all trace of his presence would disappear.
Let's ignore, if we can, the casual racism. This is Scotland in the 1860s, and Jenkin had a point. Variation is the stuff of evolution, and if variation blends, then it disappears. And as it disappears, so the power of natural selection ebbs away.
Jenkin's challenge was serious, and Darwin had no response. How could he? His theory required some system, some law of inheritance in which variation did not blend, but remained stable over the generations. And yet, no one really knew how such a system could work. The thing is, Darwin knew all this. And we know that he knew, because he told us so.
Perhaps the most wonderful chapter of The Origin of Species is chapter 6. It's called Difficulties of the Theory. Charles Darwin exposes with unbearable candor, devastating honesty, all the weaknesses of his theory. He tells us all the reasons he may be wrong, the reasons that his critics pointed out, and more. But then appeals to future generations of scientists to draw inspiration from his book, solve the difficulties with which his theory is riddled.
It's easy to forget that Darwin was not the first evolutionist. 50 years before The Origin of Species, a Frenchman had proposed a theory of evolution, albeit less coherent and comprehensive than Darwin's. His name, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck.
Lamarck was professor of zoology at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle. He published his ideas on evolution in the year that Darwin was born. They were, however, very different.
When an animal, any animal, uses an organ, Lamarck argued, it becomes strengthened and enlarged. That's fairly obvious. We all know that exercise modifies the shape of our body. It's the same for other creatures as well. But Lamarck went further. He argued that these changes, acquired in one's lifetime, were passed on. And it is this, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, as it came to be known, that's the engine of evolution. The icon of Lamarckism is the giraffe. According to Lamarck, some ancestral giraffe had stretched its neck, reaching for leaves on the highest branches. That stretched neck had been passed on to its offspring, who, in turn, had stretched their necks even further, so that now all giraffes have long necks. There is a seductive, intuitive quality to Lamarck's logic, one that Darwin, confronting the inadequacies of his own theory, found increasingly hard to resist.
The giraffe's neck is a cliché. It's in every textbook that explains the difference between Darwinian and Lamarckian evolution. But if you actually read what Darwin says about the giraffe in the 6th and final edition of The Origin, what you find is something rather different. First, he talks about natural selection. That's what gives you the giraffe's neck. But then he adds another line about the inherited effects of the increased use of parts. Together, they give you the giraffe's neck. Increased use of parts? What's going on here? That's pure Lamarck. Can it be that Darwin, in his dotage, is becoming less Darwinian?
Well, yes. Perhaps natural selection is not as powerful as once he had thought. A recantation? No. Just the candor of an old man who had spent his life trying to understand the world. Darwin died in April 1882. He had wanted to be buried quietly near his house in Kent, but his supporters arranged a funeral here at Westminster Abbey. They turned the agnostic into a saint of the new secular materialist age. It was the apotheosis of Charles Robert Darwin. He had become a Great Britain. But the eulogies rang hollow. Darwin had shown that life on Earth was the result of natural laws. But what were those laws? Everyone that is, who mattered, agreed that evolution was a fact. But natural selection? No thanks. Even as Darwin lay in state, some Darwinians were breaking ranks. Chief among them, Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries. Inspired by Darwin, he was searching for a suitable organism with which to investigate the workings of inheritance, and found one. He chose a plant called Endeavour Lamarckiana, but gardeners will know it as the evening primrose, for it blooms at dusk. It's found throughout the dunes that protect Holland from the sea, and it's really just a weed, though lovely for all that. De Vries discovered that Endeavour Lamarckiana occasionally produces progeny that look very different from itself, that have different stems, leaves, flowers. These new variants, he found, did not blend, but were stable as new species. Coining a term, de Vries called these dramatic transformations mutations. Following his discovery, de Vries was made director of the Botanical Gardens in Amsterdam. He bred and crossbred more Endeavours, 53,000 of them. It seems like a lot, but then again, he was Dutch. This is the palm house that Amsterdam built for de Vries, and these are some of his flowers pressed for posterity. They're ancient and desiccated, but you can still see the differences in growth and form. Mutation, it seemed, could produce radically new plants. It could even, said de Vries, produce new species. This was all very un-Darwinian. What of the vertiginous timescales, the infinity of incremental steps, the grandeur of Darwin's view of life? Irrelevant, said de Vries. The origin of species requires only one thing: mutation. He called it his mutation theory. It made him famous. For Lamarck, he said, the origin of species was a natural phenomenon. For Darwin, the object of scientific investigation. For de Vries, he liked to talk of himself in the third person. It was the object of experimental inquiry. Lamarck, Darwin, de Vries. No doubts about his place in the pantheon then. What de Vries, or no one else, realized at the time
was that Inothera lamarckiana was a genetic freak. Few other organisms mutate so spectacularly. He had based his entire theory on one very peculiar species. That, however, didn't stop the rise of mutationism. Others began to investigate the oddities of nature. In Britain, a Cambridge biologist, William Bateson, published Materials for the Study of Variation, a collection of two-headed turtles, girls with 4 ears, and 8-fingered hands. It was a medieval monsters and marvels book reworked for the evolutionary age. Mutation was the real creative force behind evolution, and natural selection, said the mutationists, just wasn't needed. London, 1909. Darwin is long dead, and his theory is 50 years old. The British Museum of Natural History celebrates with an exhibition of Darwiniana. Specimens, letters, manuscripts. It's a magnificent celebration, a worthy commemoration of the man who gave us evolution. But something is missing, something upon which the organizers refuse to be drawn. Natural selection.
You might have expected that the South Kensington Museum, now a temple of evolutionism, would have wanted to tell the public about Darwin's theory. But no, that's all too controversial for the keepers and curators who'd much rather not commit themselves in the great evolution debate. Hardly courageous, but understandable. By 1909, scientific consensus had shifted against Darwin's theory.
Evolution by natural selection was almost extinct.